Hey my friend, welcome to Sleepy Old World. Settle in, get comfortable. Because the place we're about to step into is one almost everyone assumes they remember perfectly. By the time we're done, you'll see it was never quite what it looked like on the surface. Before we go any further, just a quiet word. If these evenings together have turned into something of a habit for you, hitting subscribe would mean more than you'd think. And if what follows ends up easing you into sleep tonight, leaving a like is a small thing that keeps this channel going. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a quiet bedroom somewhere in Tennessee, or a cozy couch in a living room in Oregon. I do read every comment, every single time. Okay, love, let your hands rest and breathe slowly. Let's step inside. We're going to spend tonight inside an American shopping mall in 1978. And I want to tell you right away that this is not going to be the version you're picturing. Forget the wide marble atrium, forget the glossy stock footage of teenagers laughing under bright lights that gets used in every nostalgic documentary about the era. That version is real, in its way, but it is the version built for cameras. The version we're going into tonight is smaller than that, and quieter, and a little stranger because it is built around one specific Saturday afternoon, seen through the eyes of one specific girl, who does not know yet that she is standing inside something that grown men spent years designing, specifically to make her forget she was being studied. It is just past 11 in the morning, and the light coming through her bedroom curtains has that particular yellow-orange quality that only seems to exist in 1970s photographs. The kind that makes everything look slightly underwater, slightly warm, slightly gone already even while it is still happening. There is a record playing low on her dresser, the volume turned down so her mother will not knock on the door and ask her to turn it off. And underneath the music you can hear the specific squeak of her closet door, the one that needs oil and that nobody in the house has gotten around to fixing. She's standing in front of a full-length mirror, nailed slightly crooked to the back of that closet door, turning sideways, frowning, turning back. This is where I want to slow down, because the surface of this story is the mall, but the real story, the one underneath, is about a kind of freedom that nobody quite explains correctly anymore. Here is the strange thing. For a girl like this, in 1978, the shopping mall was one of the only places in the entire world where she could be unsupervised, unaccompanied by a parent, and treated like a basically competent adult human being, all at the same time. Not the movies, where you sat in the dark and watched something rather than lived something. Not a friend's house, which still had that friend's mother somewhere down the hall. The mall, a vast indoor town square built entirely out of stores, where a teenage girl could walk in through automatic doors that hissed open for her, and walk out 4 hours later having made every single decision about her own afternoon herself. And that is the detail I want you to sit with for a second, because it is the quiet paradox running underneath this whole evening. The mall felt like freedom. It felt like the first taste of being grown, of being trusted, of being let loose into the world to make her own choices about where to go and what to buy and who to be seen with. And at the exact same time, nearly everything about that building, the layout, the lighting, the temperature, the music drifting down from speakers she never thought to look for, had been engineered by men in distant offices specifically to predict what she would do and to nudge her gently, invisibly, toward doing it. She was as free as she had ever been in her life. She was also, in a sense she could not have named and would not have believed if you told her, exactly where someone wanted her to be. She settles, finally, on the outfit she had actually planned on Tuesday after all. A pair of high-waisted jeans, the wide-leg kind that everyone is wearing this year, paired with a peasant blouse with little embroidered flowers at the collar that her mother bought her 2 birthdays ago, and that has only now become, by some mysterious shift in the social weather, cool again. She digs through a shoebox at the back of her closet for a pair of cork-soled sandals, the kind with the thick wooden heel that makes a specific clunking sound on tile floors, a sound she has come to associate, almost without realizing it, with being somewhere that is not home. There is a brush on her dresser tangled with strands of hair in 3 different shades, hers and her sister's, and she runs it through quickly, parting her hair down the centre, the way the girl in last month's magazine had hers parted, feathered slightly at the sides with a round brush and a hairdryer that takes up nearly the whole bathroom counter when it is plugged in. The phone rings. Not her phone, because there is no such thing yet as her phone, not in any sense you would recognise. There is the phone, singular, mounted on the kitchen wall downstairs with a cord long enough to stretch, just barely, into the pantry if you want a little privacy, which everyone in this house has learned to do at one point or another. She thunders down the stairs in her socks, nearly missing the last 2 steps, and gets to it on the 4th ring, breathless, already knowing who it is before she even says hello, because there is really only one person it could be at 11:40 on a Saturday morning. It's her best friend, Donna. Or maybe her name is something else entirely in your version of this. Linda, Karen, Patty. It does not particularly matter, because every girl in 1978 had a Donna or a Linda or a Karen. The one person whose voice on the other end of a phone line could turn an ordinary Saturday into an event. They run through the plan one more time, even though they have run through it twice already this week. Donna's older brother is driving them. He has his license now. He got it in March. And he is annoyed about being asked, but he's going anyway because their mother asked him to. And because, if she is honest, Donna's brother is not as annoyed as he pretends to be about driving 2 16-year-old girls to the mall, since it gives him an excuse to be there himself, ostensibly waiting in the parking lot, actually wandering toward the record store the second their backs are turned. There is a particular kind of urgency in this phone call that has nothing to do with anything being wrong. 2 girls who will be standing next to each other in under an hour are still talking as though there is something pressing left to discuss. "What should I wear?" Donna asks, even though she has clearly already decided, because the question is not really a question, it is a ritual, a way of checking in, a way of saying I'm thinking about this the same way you are thinking about this. We are doing this together. "Wear the gun sax dress," she tells Donna, the white one with the lace at the sleeves, and Donna makes a small delighted sound on the other end of the line, because that is exactly the answer she was hoping for. I find something quietly moving in that, honestly. Decades from now, this same impulse, this need to narrate your getting ready process to someone else in real time, would migrate onto screens, onto platforms neither of these girls could have imagined, broadcast not to one friend on a landline but to thousands of strangers at once. The need itself never really changed, only the size of the room it happened in. Her mother is in the kitchen when she finally comes down dressed and ready. The radio on low, something with a lot of strings and a man's voice crooning about love in the general, unspecific way that 1978 love songs tended to do. There is a plate of something on the counter. Toast gone slightly cold because breakfast has been an afterthought for everyone in this house since about 10 o'clock, and her mother glances up and says, the thing mothers in this exact decade tended to say, which is some version of "you're not wearing that, are you?" delivered without any real heat behind it, more reflex than complaint. She is wearing that. Her mother sighs in the specific way mothers sigh when they have decided the battle is not worth fighting today, and goes back to whatever she was doing, and that is the entire negotiation, settled in under 15 seconds, the way these things so often were. Donna's brother pulls up outside in a car that smells, the second she climbs into the back seat, of vinyl upholstery baking slightly in the sun, and the particular sweetish chemical tang of a pine tree air freshener clipped to the rearview mirror. The kind shaped like an actual tree. Green, hanging there slightly off-centre, no matter how many times someone tries to straighten it. The radio in the car is tuned to a station playing something with a strong, insistent bass line underneath it. The kind of song that has been inescapable on every station for months now. Disco having fully arrived and shown no particular sign of leaving. Donna's brother drums his fingers on the steering wheel at a red light without quite admitting he likes the song. Nobody comments on this. Everybody notices. The drive itself takes maybe 12 minutes, through a part of town that has been quietly reshaping itself for the better part of a decade. The older downtown storefronts are a little emptier than they used to be. Certain shops that once anchored the main street now sitting dark behind their own windows, because the gravity of the town has been shifting slowly and almost without anyone deciding it on purpose, out toward the highway interchange, toward a wide, flat parcel of land that used to be a dairy farm and is now home to acres of parking lots surrounding one enormous, low, windowless building. You can see it from a half-mile away, just the roofline at first, then the sign, lit even in daylight, the name of the mall spelled out in letters tall enough to read from the highway. I want to tell you something about that building before we walk into it, because I think it changes the way the next few hours feel once you know it. The man most responsible for inventing the enclosed shopping mall as we picture it was not American at all. He was an Austrian-born architect named Victor Gruen, a Jewish refugee who fled Vienna in 1938, just ahead of the Nazi annexation, and who landed eventually in the United States with, depending on which version of the story you read, somewhere between a handful of dollars and almost nothing at all to his name. In 1956, in a suburb of Minneapolis called Edina, he opened something called Southdale Center, and it was, as far as anyone can determine, the first fully enclosed, climate-controlled shopping mall in the country. 2 levels, a garden court with a goldfish pond, and a genuine living eucalyptus tree growing improbably under an artificial sky in the middle of a Minnesota winter. Here is the part that I think gets left out of almost every nostalgic retelling of mall history, and it is the part that stayed with me the first time I read it properly. Gruen did not actually want to build what got built. His vision, at least as he described it later in interviews and in his own writing, was something closer to a real town centre, a civic heart, with apartments upstairs, a post office, a library branch, maybe a skating rink. Public gathering spaces that had nothing to do with retail at all, woven in among the stores. He wanted to recreate something like European Town Square for the new, sprawling, car-dependent American suburb, a place that would actually knit a community together rather than simply sell to it. What he got instead, almost immediately, was developers stripping out every civic element he had designed in, every plaza and library and public bench that did not generate rent, and keeping only the retail. By the late 1960s, Gruen had grown so disillusioned with what his invention had become that he reportedly stood up at a conference of shopping centre developers in London late in his career and disowned the whole genre, calling the cheap, repetitive strip mall version of his idea that had spread across America and I am going to use his own word here because I think it is worth hearing exactly how sharp his disappointment had become, a bastard development. He said he wanted nothing more to do with it. Some accounts even have him refusing to set foot inside American shopping malls again for the rest of his life. Although I will be honest with you, that detail is the kind that has been repeated so often in so many places that it has started to take on the shine of legend, and I'm not entirely certain it is 100% literally true. Either way, the man who more or less invented the mall spent his final years trying to take credit back for it, and largely failing. None of this, of course, is on the mind of the 16-year-old girl in the back seat of Donna's brother's car as the building grows larger through the windshield. To her, it is simply the mall. The only one within 20 minutes of home, the place that has existed, as far as she's concerned, since the beginning of time, even though it opened only 6 years ago, and her own mother can still remember the dairy farm that used to occupy this exact patch of land. That is the strange privilege of being 16. The world as it currently exists feels permanent, feels like it has always been this way, simply because you arrived too recently to remember otherwise. There is also tucked into the design of buildings like this one, a piece of retail folklore that I find genuinely fascinating and that I want to mention here even though we cannot fully confirm where it came from. Architect and retail designers of this era talk, sometimes only half-jokingly, about something called the Gruen transfer, or the Gruen effect, named, rightly or wrongly, after the very same Victor Gruen. The idea is this: a shopper walks into an enclosed mall with a specific limited purpose, pick up new shoelaces, return a sweater, and somewhere within the first few minutes inside, surrounded by an environment with no visible clocks, no windows to the outside world, no natural light to track the hour by, curved walkways that discourage a straight, purposeful line from one end of the building to the other, that shopper experiences a kind of soft disorientation. Their sense of time loosens its grip, their original purpose blurs at the edges, and they begin almost involuntarily to wander, to browse, to linger in front of windows they had no intention of stopping at. Whether Gruen himself ever used that phrase, or even fully endorsed the manipulation it describes, is something historians genuinely argue about. But the phenomenon itself, the strange loosening of time that happens inside a sealed, sunless building built for exactly that purpose, is something almost everyone who grew up going to malls in this era will tell you they recognize the moment you describe it to them. The car pulls into a parking lot that is already, even at this hour, filling up with the specific, patient logic of suburban parking lots everywhere. Rows of cars angled in under light poles tall enough to cast long, thin shadows even at noon. Donna's brother finds a spot near one of the Anchor department stores, cuts the engine and announces, with the studied carelessness of an 18-year-old trying not to seem too eager about anything, that he will be around, that they should meet back here by 4, that if they need money for the bus home instead they had better not come crying to him about it. The two girls climb out, smooth down their clothes, exchange a look that needs no translation, and walk together toward the nearest set of doors. And here is where I want you to notice the first real sensory detail of the day, the one that if you grew up anywhere near a mall in this exact era, will probably reach back and touch something in your own memory you had forgotten was still there. The doors slide open with a soft pneumatic hiss, and what hits her first is not a sight at all, it is a smell. 3 distinct layers of it, arriving almost simultaneously. Underneath everything, the cool, slightly metallic breath of industrial air conditioning, working overtime against the heat outside. Threaded through that, the sweet, almost candy-like smell of fresh popcorn from a cart positioned, not by accident, directly inside the main entrance. And somewhere above both of those, drifting down from the cosmetics counter of the department store they are walking past, a thick cloud of competing perfumes, each one sprayed liberally onto paper testing strips by a saleswoman in a smart blazer, the smells blending into something that is not quite any single scent anymore, but has become, instead, simply the smell of the mall itself, instantly recognizable, never quite replicated anywhere else. The light changes too, the moment they step inside. Outside it was the flat, slightly harsh light of a Saturday afternoon. In here it comes down softer, filtered through enormous skylights set into a vaulted ceiling 2 stories above her head, the light pooling in wide circles on the tile floor below, catching the spray of a fountain in the central court and scattering it into tiny floating rainbows that drift and dissolve depending on which way you tip your head. There is a low, constant murmur of Muzak playing from speakers she has genuinely never thought to look for, an orchestral, lyricless version of a song that was, a year or 2 ago, something with actual words and a singer and a personality, now smoothed down into elevator strings, stripped of everything that made it feel like anything at all, which is of course precisely the point. Music that asks nothing of you. Music designed to be heard by everyone and noticed by no one. Maybe she has been here 40 times already this year. Maybe this is only her 3rd or 4th visit without a parent trailing somewhere behind her. Either way, there is a specific settling feeling that comes over her the moment those doors close behind her, and the outside world, with its heat and its yard work and its Saturday morning chores still half finished on the kitchen counter, simply stops existing for a while. In here, none of that is real. In here there is only the fountain and the stores arranged in their long gleaming rows and Donna beside her, and 4 uninterrupted hours that belong for once entirely to the 2 of them. They stand for a moment near the central court getting their bearings, even though they both know this mall the way you know the layout of your own house, by feel rather than by thought. The fountain at the center is the kind built specifically for this purpose, a wide, shallow basin lined in small tan and brown tiles arranged in a sunburst pattern, with 3 separate jets of water rising and falling in a loose, syncopated rhythm that someone, somewhere, programmed to look spontaneous and is not spontaneous at all. Coins glint at the bottom of it, pennies mostly, tossed in by children with a wish, by teenagers with nothing better to do with loose change, by at least 1 or 2 adults who toss a coin in out of pure habit and could not tell you why if you asked. Around the fountain, on low circular benches, a scattering of people sit, some clearly waiting for someone else, some simply resting their feet. A few elderly couples who Donna's brother would tell you if you asked him. Treat this entire building as a kind of indoor walking track, here every single morning before the stores have even properly opened, doing slow laps past darkened storefronts for the exercise and the air conditioning. Long before the term mall walker existed to describe what they were doing, there is a hierarchy to this mall, an unspoken one, never written down anywhere, never explained to her directly by anyone, and yet she understood it completely by the time she was maybe 13, absorbed the way children absorb the rules of a game they were never formally taught. The department stores anchoring either end of the building, the big ones, the ones whose names her grandmother would also recognize, are not where you go to be seen. They are where your mother takes you to buy school shoes, fluorescent lit, vast, slightly boring, full of racks of clothing organized by size rather than by anything resembling personality. The stores that matter, the ones in the middle stretch of the mall, the smaller storefronts squeezed in between the anchors, those are where the actual social life of a 16-year-old plays out. The record store, the shop that sells nothing but candles and incense and little brass trinkets that smell faintly of patchouli the second you walk past the open doorway. The clothing store 2 doors down that plays its own music louder than the mall's Muzak, deliberately, defiantly, as a kind of statement about who shops there and who does not. Donna pulls her by the sleeve toward the record store first, because Donna always wants the record store first. And inside it the air is different again, cooler somehow, dimmer. The overhead lights turn down low enough that the posters taped to the walls, mostly album covers blown up to enormous size, seem to glow faintly in the dimness. 1978 is, depending on who you ask, either the absolute peak or the beginning of the slow, exhausted end of disco's complete takeover of American popular culture, and the record store reflects that completely. An entire wall given over to a film soundtrack that has, by this point in the year, become less an album and more a kind of cultural weather system, impossible to avoid, playing from car radios and department store speaker systems, and now, here, from the speakers mounted somewhere above the register, the bass line thudding pleasantly through the floor tiles under her cork-soled sandals. She flips through the bins methodically, the way she always does, running a finger along the top edge of the album sleeves, pausing here and there to pull one halfway out and study the cover before sliding it back. There is a particular skill to this, to looking like you know exactly what you are looking for, while actually just enjoying the simple physical pleasure of being surrounded by hundreds of album covers, each one its own tiny universe of typography and photography, each one promising something about who you might become if you brought it home and played it loud enough behind a closed bedroom door. She does not buy anything today, neither does Donna in the end, though they both spend a solid 20 minutes acting as though a purchase is imminent. This brings me to something I think is genuinely worth pausing on, because it explains so much about why malls felt the way they felt to teenagers specifically. There was an understood, unstated allowance for how long you could occupy a store without buying anything before the social contract started to strain. Browse for 10 minutes, nobody notices. Browse for 20, and the clerk behind the counter, usually someone not all that much older than you are, might start refolding the same stack of shirts near where you are standing. A small, deniable signal. Linger for 30 minutes without so much as touching your wallet, and you would feel it, a kind of pressure in the air. Not hostile exactly, but present. A silent question hanging over the whole transaction of simply existing in this space. The mall offered the illusion of an infinite free public living room. The reality underneath was that every square foot of it belonged to someone who needed you to eventually buy something, or at the very least move along and let someone else stand there pretending to shop instead. Stay with me here for a second, because there is a small contradiction buried in that arrangement that I find quietly funny, and I am not sure it has ever fully resolved itself even now, decades later, in whatever the modern version of this same impulse looks like. The whole appeal of the mall, for a girl like this, is that it does not feel like a store. It feels like a town. It feels like the one place you are allowed to simply exist in public, without a destination, without a purpose, without an adult standing over your shoulder asking what exactly you think you are doing here. And yet every single inch of that feeling has been manufactured, calculated, dressed up specifically to disguise that you are in fact standing inside the single most purpose-built commercial environment that anyone in this town has ever set foot in. Freedom that is, in a sense, on loan. Freedom with a closing time printed somewhere on a sign by the door, even if nobody reads it on the way in. It is while they are still in the record store, Donna now examining the back cover of an album she has already decided not to buy, that the boy appears. Not dramatically. Nothing about this moment announces itself the way it would in a movie. No swelling music, no slow turn of the head. He is simply there, a few bins over, flipping through a section of the store, with the studied disinterest of someone who knows he is being watched and is enjoying it slightly more than he would ever admit. Maybe she has known him since the 3rd grade, gone to school with him every year since, watched him transform gradually from a boy who picked his nose during assembly into someone whose presence now makes her stomach do something complicated and faintly ridiculous. Maybe she barely knows him at all, has only seen him twice before, once at a football game and once here, in this exact store, weeks ago, a coincidence that has in her mind taken on a significance probably far larger than it deserves. There is a protocol for this too, unwritten but completely understood, passed down through some informal teenage telegraph that nobody ever consciously teaches, but everybody somehow learns. You do not walk directly over. You do not make this obvious. Instead, you drift, slowly, plausibly, toward the section of the store nearest to where he is standing, suddenly extremely interested in an album you have absolutely no intention of buying. And you wait, with your heart going at a slightly embarrassing rate, for the moment when proximity becomes unavoidable enough that a conversation can happen without either of you having to admit you orchestrated it. Donna, to her credit, understands this without being told, and finds an urgent reason to examine something 3 full aisles away, granting the kind of careful, generous distance that only a best friend truly understands how to give. He says something. She does not afterward fully remember what, only that it was something small and unremarkable, a comment about the album in her hands, a question about whether she is going to the football game next Friday, and that none of it mattered in the slightest compared to the simple fact that he had said it directly to her, in a public place with other people around, where anyone might have seen. That detail, the where anyone might have seen part, matters more than you would think. A conversation with a boy you like conducted in private is one thing. The exact same conversation conducted here in the middle of the record store, under the fluorescent glow and the low Muzak, where it might be witnessed and reported back through the same informal telegraph that brought him close enough to talk to in the first place, is something else entirely. It is evidence. It is the beginning of a story other people might tell about her on Monday. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it gets flattened out in the warm haze of nostalgia that surrounds this entire era. Underneath the soft lighting and the fountain and the easy freedom of an afternoon with nowhere particular to be, there was real anxiety running through every minute of this for a girl her age, and it rarely had anything to do with anything serious. It had to do with whether Donna's brother would actually come back at 4 like he said he would. It had to do with whether the outfit she chose this morning, the one that felt exactly right in her bedroom mirror, would still feel right once she saw it reflected back in the windows of stores she was walking past. next to girls who seemed to have effortlessly gotten it more correct than she had. It had to do with the specific, quiet dread of being spotted standing alone, even for 30 seconds, even just while Donna used the restroom, because being alone in a mall at 16 carried a kind of social weight that being alone almost anywhere else simply did not. Alone in your bedroom is just being alone. Alone in the mall, somehow, reads as something closer to abandoned. None of this is dramatic. None of this would make for an interesting story if she told it to anyone later. And that is exactly why it has mostly disappeared from how we remember this era now. Smoothed over by the warm filter of looking back, the soft focus of old photographs and old songs replacing the more complicated, more ordinary texture of what it actually felt like to be 16 and slightly unsure of yourself, standing in a fluorescent lit building, hoping nobody noticed the half second when you did not know exactly where to put your hands. They eventually pull themselves away from the record store, Donna throwing one last unreadable look back toward the boy, who has by now wandered off toward the section with the imported British albums, pretending, as far as anyone can tell, not to notice that they are leaving. The next stop, by long-standing ritual, is the clothing boutique 2 doors down, the one with the music turned up louder than the mall allows the Muzak speakers to go. A small act of rebellion that the mall's management apparently tolerates because the store does enough business that nobody wants to make an issue of it. Racks of clothing are arranged not by size, the way the department stores do it, but by some looser, more intuitive logic that seems to change every time they visit. Organized this week, it looks like, by color, a wall of denim transitioning gradually into a wall of pale yellows and creams. Donna heads straight for a rack near the back where a new shipment of designer jeans has just arrived, a brand whose name is stitched in small, deliberate script along the back pocket, jeans that cost considerably more than the jeans either of their mothers would consider reasonable for a 16-year-old. Jeans that have, within the space of about a year, become a kind of silent currency among certain girls at school, a way of signaling something without saying anything at all. She herself does not have the money for a pair today, and is not entirely sure she would spend it on jeans even if she did, but there is a specific pleasure in simply touching the denim, running a thumb along the stitching, holding a pair up against her own waist in the mirror to see for a moment who she might be if she were the kind of girl who owned them. There is something underneath this, something about the year 1978 specifically, that is worth pulling out into the light for a second. This is roughly the moment when designer denim, a category of clothing that did not meaningfully exist a decade earlier, starts to become a serious cultural force. Jeans transforming from purely practical workwear into something closer to a status object, something with a name attached, a name you are meant to recognize and ideally be a little impressed by. The whole concept feels almost quaint now. Looking back, the idea that a pair of pants could carry that much social information stitched onto a back pocket, and yet if you think about it for more than a second, it has not really gone anywhere at all. The logo has just moved. The pocket has just become a sneaker, a phone case, a logo stamped somewhere else entirely. The impulse underneath it, the wanting to be recognized as someone with good enough taste or enough money or enough access to know which thing is currently the right thing, has never actually left us. It just keeps finding new fabric to land on. She tries on a dress in the fitting room at the back. A small curtained booth with a mirror just slightly too narrow to give the full picture, lit by a single bare bulb overhead that makes everything, flatteringly or unflatteringly depending on the day, look slightly golden. The curtain does not fully close, leaves a gap of maybe 2 inches that she has to angle her body to avoid, a small daily indignity nobody thinks to mention when they talk about the glamour of going shopping. The dress does not fit quite right in the shoulders. She buys nothing here either in the end, though she will remember, years from now, the specific way the light fell in that booth far longer than she will remember whether the dress was even particularly nice. Next door, almost as if the mall planned it this way, which in a sense it absolutely did, is a small shop selling nothing but novelties, the kind of store that exists in some form in nearly every mall of this era and seems, somehow, to carry the exact same inventory no matter which state you find it in. lava lamps glowing slowly in the front window, their wax blobs rising and falling in a rhythm that has nothing to do with the music playing inside. Black light posters stacked along one wall, mostly unicorns and wizards, and one particularly enormous poster of a tiger that nobody she has ever met has actually purchased, but that has apparently been hanging in this exact spot since the store opened. A whole rotating display case of mood rings, the kind that supposedly change color according to your emotional state, though anyone who has ever actually worn one for more than an afternoon knows perfectly well that what they are really responding to is simple skin temperature. Nothing more mystical than that. A fact that does absolutely nothing to dampen anyone's enthusiasm for them. She buys one anyway. A mood ring, deep blue at rest in the display case, costing less than $2, which she slides onto her finger the second the cashier hands back her change, watching it almost immediately begin to shift, the stone warming from her own body heat into a slightly different shade of green within a few minutes. There is no real reason to want this object. It does nothing useful. It tells her nothing she did not already know about her own emotional state, and yet there is something genuinely lovely about the impulse behind it. The desire to wear a small, cheap, slightly absurd piece of jewelry that claims, however falsely, to make your inner life visible to the world. We have never really stopped wanting that, have we? We have just changed what we wear on our hands to try to say it. The mood ring itself is, at this point, only a few years old as an actual product, first patented and sold in the mid-1970s by a pair of inventors working with a thermochromic liquid crystal, a material that genuinely does change color in response to temperature, a real piece of material science underneath what otherwise reads as pure novelty store nonsense. The marketing built around it, the little printed card claiming each color corresponds to a specific named emotion, calm or passionate or anxious, was layered on top of that real science afterward, a clever sales story attached to a genuine physical phenomenon, which is, if you think about it, a fairly accurate description of how an enormous amount of consumer product marketing actually works. True underneath, embellished on top, sold as something a little more magical than the plain mechanism actually deserves. By now it is somewhere around 1 in the afternoon, though neither of them has checked the time in nearly an hour, which is of course precisely the effect that windowless ceiling and that clockless wall and that gently looping Muzak were designed to produce. They drift toward the drugstore at the far end of this wing, a smaller, more practical store compared to the boutiques, fluorescent lit in a way that does nobody's complexion any favors, but home to a cosmetics aisle that the two of them treat with something close to reverence. Rows of lip gloss in flavors that have nothing to do with anything found in nature, watermelon and bubblegum, and something called on the label, Dro pepper, sold in small plastic pots shaped like tiny soda bottles. Donna unscrews one, sniffs it, declares it perfect, and tucks it into her bag along with a small, slightly furtive glance toward the front counter to make sure nobody is paying particular attention. Further along, a wall of perfume in glass bottles, most of them priced beyond what either girl carries in her purse today, but one in particular, a pale pink bottle with a soft focus, almost childlike label, sits at a price point clearly calculated for exactly this audience, marketed in magazine advertisements that promise, more or less directly, that wearing it will make boys think of you as sweet and innocent and very faintly, carefully, just barely grown up. She has owned a bottle of this before, has worn it to school dances, has it sitting half empty on her dresser at home right now, and there is something about smelling the tester strip here, in this exact aisle, surrounded by the specific hum of drugstore fluorescent lighting, that brings back an entire winter of memories in about 1.5 seconds, the way scent does, faster and more completely than almost anything else. I think this detail, more than almost any other from this whole afternoon, is the one that tends to ambush people decades later. Somebody catches a stray trace of a similar scent on a crowded train or in an elevator, completely unrelated to anything happening in their life that day, and is simply transported, instantly and without warning, back into a body that is 16 years old again. standing in a drugstore aisle under buzzing fluorescent light, with absolutely no advance notice that any of this was about to happen. The mind keeps scent filed away somewhere stranger and more direct than memory usually works, closer to the surface than it has any right to be. Hunger arrives, as it tends to, somewhere around the time their feet start to ache slightly from the cork-soled sandals, and they make their way toward the small cluster of food vendors near the center court. Not yet the sprawling, multi-cuisine food courts that would become standard in malls built just a few years later, but a more modest arrangement, 3 or 4 separate counters scattered along one stretch of the corridor, rather than gathered together under one roof. There is a stand selling hot dogs rotating slowly on metal rollers under a heat lamp. There is a small bakery counter with a glass case of cookies the size of small plates, and there is what they have actually been walking toward this entire time without quite admitting it out loud. A stand with a brightly lettered sign and a machine in the window endlessly churning a thick, foamy, bright orange liquid that smells, even from 30 feet away, like concentrated sunshine. This particular drink, a strange frothy concoction of orange juice and crushed ice and something else, something a little eggy and a little vanilla underneath that nobody she knows has ever quite identified, and that the company itself has never fully revealed, originated, of all places, in Los Angeles decades before this exact Saturday, as the brainchild of a man trying to sell a different, more bitter style of orange juice to a skeptical public, and discovering, through some combination of luck and showmanship, that what people actually wanted was something closer to a milkshake wearing an orange juice costume. By 1978 it has become, alongside the hot pretzel and the soft pretzel and the cinnamon-dusted fried dough sold a few stands down, one of the load-bearing pillars of mall snacking culture, the smell of it as recognizable, in its own way, as the smell of the popcorn cart by the front doors. They sit on the low-tiled lip of the fountain to drink theirs, watching the water rise and fall in its programmed, almost spontaneous rhythm, watching other people pass in loose clusters, groups of boys moving with the specific loud, performative confidence of boys who know they are being looked at and are enjoying it, groups of younger kids trailing slightly behind exhausted-looking mothers, an older couple doing one more slow, contented lap before heading to the parking lot. Nobody here is in a hurry. That is perhaps the entire point of the building, when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. A place engineered down to the last architectural decision to remove hurry entirely from the experience of spending money. Donna wants to stop at the arcade next, tucked into a narrow space between the bookstore and a shoe repair counter that always seems to be there and never seems to have any customers, and which she has, in all her years of coming to this mall, never once seen anyone actually walk into. The arcade itself is small, maybe a dozen machines lined up against 2 facing walls, dim except for the glow of the screens themselves, and a string of red and blue neon tubing running along the ceiling. The whole room thick with a specific electronic warble, beeps and chirps layering over each other from half a dozen different games running simultaneously, none of them quite in rhythm with the others. Most of the machines here are older, simpler things, a driving game with a steering wheel worn smooth and slightly sticky from thousands of hands before hers, a row of pinball machines with their back-glass artwork lit from behind, knights and spaceships, and in one case, a improbably glamorous woman in a red dress who has nothing whatsoever to do with the actual gameplay, but who exists purely to be looked at while quarters disappear. But there is one new machine just arrived this month, according to a hand-lettered sign taped above it, that has already developed its own small, devoted crowd of teenage boys standing 2 and 3 deep, watching rather than playing, because there is only room for one player at a time and the line, unofficial as it is, moves slowly. This is, although nobody standing in this arcade tonight has any way of knowing it yet, a genuinely significant moment in the quiet, mostly undocumented history of how Americans would eventually spend their leisure time. The game is called Space Invaders, designed in Japan and only just beginning, this very year, to make its way into American arcades. and within roughly 12 months it would become so overwhelmingly popular, so relentlessly fed with quarters, that it would, according to more than one account from the period, create a temporary nationwide coin shortage, banks and arcade owners scrambling to keep enough quarters in circulation to satisfy demand. Nobody in this arcade tonight has any sense of any of that yet. They just know it is new and loud and strangely hypnotic. Rows of slow, deliberate alien shapes descending the screen in lockstep while a single cannon at the bottom fires upward. The pace of the descending aliens accelerating almost imperceptibly at first and then unmistakably the longer you survive. Donna spends 2 quarters on it and loses both lives within about 90 seconds, laughing unbothered, already moving on to a pinball machine instead, the one with the spaceship artwork, which she has clearly played here many times before, her hands finding the flipper buttons with the easy confidence of muscle memory. There is a specific physical pleasure in pinball that the newer electronic games do not quite replicate. The heft of the machine itself, the way it shudders slightly under your palms when you nudge it, the mechanical clatter of the ball against the bumpers, a game that exists fundamentally in the real physical world, rather than only on a screen. Even as the screen-based games beginning to arrive this year will, within a decade, push almost all of its kind into a kind of permanent retirement. I want to slow down here just for a moment, because I think there is something quietly poignant buried inside this exact arcade in this exact year that is easy to miss if you are moving too quickly through the story. This room, right now, tonight, contains both the future and the past of arcade entertainment standing side by side. The pinball machines that had dominated rooms exactly like this one for 50 years already starting, almost without anyone fully registering it yet, to give ground to the flickering electronic screens that would eventually replace them almost entirely. Nobody standing here tonight, watching the line form for Space Invaders, understands that they are witnessing the early, barely visible edge of an enormous shift. It rarely announces itself as history while it is happening. It just looks, at the time, like a new game that is fun, and a line that is a little too long, and a friend laughing next to you about losing both your lives in under 2 minutes. After the arcade, they wander toward the photo booth tucked into an alcove near the restrooms. An old metal contraption with a heavy curtain hanging across the entrance, the fabric worn thin and slightly shiny in patches from years of hands pulling it closed. Inside, the booth smells faintly of someone else's hairspray, and the warm electrical smell of the machine itself working away behind its panel. Donna slides 4 quarters into the slot, and the 2 of them squeeze onto the narrow bench seat together, shoulders pressed close, already arranging their faces into the first of 4 expressions before the flash even goes off. A small countdown light blinks. The first flash catches them both mid-laugh, not posed at all, genuinely caught off guard by how bright it is in such a small space. The second, they manage something closer to composed, chins tilted just so, the way they have seen done in magazines. The third is Donna sticking her tongue out at the exact wrong moment, ruining what might have been the best shot of the set, which she will insist for years afterward was completely intentional. The fourth, the machine catches them both glancing sideways at each other instead of at the camera, an expression that captures something truer about their friendship than either of the more deliberate poses managed to. They wait outside the booth for the strip to develop, a process that takes what feels at 16 like an excruciatingly long several minutes, watching through a small slot as the chemical smell intensifies and the paper finally drops, damp and warm, into the collection tray below. 4 small black and white images, slightly grainy, slightly too dark in the corners, cut vertically into one long strip that Donna immediately tears in half, careful along the perforated edge, handing one half over without being asked, because of course they will each keep a copy, because this is simply what you do. She will keep her half tucked into the corner of her bedroom mirror for the next several years, the photograph curling slightly at the edges from humidity and time, the chemical fixative slowly degrading until the blacks turn faintly brown and the whites turn faintly yellow, until one day, much further down the road than either of them can currently imagine, she will find it again at the bottom of a drawer while clearing out a house for an entirely different reason, and the four small frozen faces, hers and Donna's, will hit her with a force that has nothing to do with the quality of the photograph and everything to do with everything the photograph cannot show. But none of that has happened yet. Right now, it is simply a nice thing to have, a small souvenir of an otherwise unremarkable Saturday, tucked carefully into the front pocket of her bag. There is a particular quality to the middle of the afternoon now, somewhere past 2 o'clock, though neither of them could tell you the exact hour with any confidence, where the urgency of the morning, the careful planning, the outfit anxiety, the rehearsed casualness near the record store, all of it has simply dissolved into something looser and more comfortable. They are no longer performing the afternoon, they are simply inside it. This, I think, is the part of mall culture that gets least talked about, and was, in its own quiet way, maybe the most valuable part of the whole experience. Not the buying, not even really the boys, or the new releases, or the trends. Just the specific rare pleasure of two teenage girls being allowed to exist somewhere, together, with no destination and no deadline beyond a vague arrangement to meet a brother's car by 4, drifting from storefront to storefront with no particular agenda beyond each other's company. They duck eventually into the department store at the far end, the one with her grandmother's familiar name stitched in script across the awning outside. Mostly because Donna wants to check the price on a winter coat she has been eyeing for weeks, and mostly, if we are being honest, because the cosmetics counter near the entrance is too good to walk past without stopping. This store is a different animal entirely from the boutiques and novelty shops further down the corridor, vast and carpeted in a way that absorbs sound almost completely, the air slightly cooler, the lighting more formal. Racks of clothing organized with a precision that suggests an entirely different generation of shopper is the intended audience here, though that has never once stopped a 16-year-old girl from wandering through anyway. The cosmetics counter is staffed by a woman in her 40s wearing a name tag and a brand of foundation that has clearly been applied with professional precision, who watches the two girls approach with an expression that manages to be both welcoming and faintly amused, the look of someone who has seen exactly this scene play out 1,000 times before and finds it, on balance, more charming than annoying. There are testers laid out along the glass counter, lipsticks worn down at odd angles from being tried and retried by dozens of hands, a small stack of tissues for blotting, a round mirror on a stand angled just so. Donna tries on a shade of blush that the saleswoman insists, with real conviction, is exactly her colouring, and for once she might actually be right. I want to mention something here about the woman behind that counter, because there is a whole quiet history sitting underneath her presence that almost nobody thinks about while standing at a department store makeup counter. The entire concept of cosmetics being sold this way, demonstrated in person by a trained specialist, samples freely offered, no obligation implied, traces back decades earlier to a handful of ambitious businesswomen who built entire empires on exactly this model, understanding something that department store executives, mostly men, had apparently failed to fully grasp, which was that women would happily spend real money on small luxuries if the experience of buying them felt generous rather than transactional. This woman behind this particular counter in this particular mall in 1978 is standing, whether she knows it or not, at the very end of a long chain of decisions made by women who came before her, fighting for a kind of commercial respectability that simply did not used to exist. Her mother, somewhere across town right now, is almost certainly nowhere near a makeup counter, is probably standing instead in her own kitchen, finishing something practical, something domestic, something that will not photograph well or get remembered fondly decades later, the kind of labour that simply disappears into the smooth running of a household without anyone, including the person doing it, fully registering it as labour at all. There is a strange kind of gap opening up, in this exact era, between the world her mother grew up expecting for herself and the world this 16-year-old daughter is currently wandering through, with a mood ring on her finger and a half-finished orange drink somewhere back near the fountain. Not a gap in love, not a gap in care, just a gap in what each of them at 16 assumed their own life would eventually look like. They do not buy anything at the cosmetics counter either, though Donna takes a small sample vial of perfume the saleswoman offers without being asked, sliding it into her bag next to the lip gloss from earlier, a tiny accumulating museum of an afternoon that cost almost nothing and will be remembered in fragments for years. Stay with me. I promise we are getting somewhere, even if it does not feel right now like a story with much of anywhere left to go. That is rather the nature of an afternoon like this one. It is not building toward a single dramatic event. It is simply accumulating, hour by hour, the small, unremarkable texture of being alive at 16 on an ordinary Saturday that will not in the moment feel like anything worth remembering at all. It is somewhere past 3, the afternoon light outside, invisible to them but somehow still felt, beginning its long, slow tilt toward evening, when they run into a small cluster of girls from school gathered near the entrance to the shoe store, the kind of group that exists in roughly every school in roughly every decade. 3 or 4 girls who have, through some combination of confidence and circumstance and an apparently bottomless supply of the right clothes, simply ended up a half step ahead of everyone else in whatever currency happens to matter that particular year. They are not unkind exactly, not today, not in any way she could point to afterward and describe as a real incident. But there is a specific, brief recalibration that happens in her own posture as she walks past them. A slight straightening, a slight adjustment of how she is holding her bag, the kind of small instinctive performance that happens almost below the level of conscious thought. One of the girls compliments her mood ring genuinely, and for about 4 seconds the entire encounter tips towards something warm and easy. The 4 of them clustered for a moment, comparing notes on which color combination means what according to the little card that came in the box, even though everyone standing there already privately suspects the whole color chart is nonsense dressed up as science. And then the moment passes the way these moments do, the group drifting onward toward wherever they were originally headed, and Donna and her best friend continue in the opposite direction, and that is the entire interaction. 4 seconds of genuine warmth folded into 30 seconds of careful social navigation, the kind of thing that would not even register as a memory if you asked her about it that same evening, and yet somehow, faintly, shapes the texture of how the rest of the afternoon feels. This, more than almost anything else happening today, is the part of being 16 that nobody quite manages to explain properly to anyone who has not lived through it recently. Every single space you move through, even a space built explicitly for leisure, even a space designed around the specific promise of freedom and ease, carries its own constant, quiet arithmetic. Who is here? Who noticed you? What that means? It is exhausting in a way she does not yet have the vocabulary to articulate, and it is also somehow simply what being 16 is, woven so completely into the fabric of every single outing that she would not know how to separate it out even if you asked her to. They duck into the bookstore next, mostly to escape that particular current of social weather for a few minutes, and the store offers exactly the kind of quiet shift in atmosphere they are both, without saying so, looking for. It is quieter in here, the carpet thicker, the lighting warmer and more yellow than the harsh fluorescence of the drugstore, rows of paperback spines arranged in long, slightly uneven columns, a smell of paper and binding glue that is its own distinct thing entirely, separate from every other smell they have encountered today. Donna heads for a rack of teen romance paperbacks near the front, their covers all variations on the same theme, a boy and a girl gazing at each other against some vaguely dramatic backdrop, a beach, a school dance, a convertible parked at sunset. She herself drifts toward a small section near the back stocked with poetry, picks up a slim volume almost at random, reads the first page standing there in the narrow aisle, puts it back, picks up another. There is a particular kind of peace available in a bookstore that the rest of the mall does not quite offer, even with its fountain and its skylights and its careful engineering toward ease. Nobody here is selling an experience exactly. Nobody here much cares whether you buy anything within the next 10 minutes. the way the boutique 2 doors down clearly did. The clerk behind the register, an older man with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, barely glances up as they enter, more interested in whatever he is doing behind the counter than in monitoring how long 2 teenage girls spend reading the backs of paperbacks they have no intention of purchasing. For a few minutes, the social arithmetic of the rest of the day simply quiets down, replaced by nothing more demanding than the small private pleasure of standing in a narrow aisle, turning pages in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. When they finally drift back out into the main corridor, the quality of the day has shifted in some way that is hard to pin down exactly. Even though nothing structural about the building has changed at all, the same skylights, the same fountain, the same low Muzak drifting from speakers nobody looks for. Maybe it is simply that her feet have started to genuinely ache inside the cork-soled sandals, the wooden heel having long since stopped feeling like a fashionable choice and started feeling like a small ongoing negotiation with her own body. Maybe it is that the crowd itself has thickened slightly, families arriving now for early dinner reservations at the one sit-down restaurant the mall contains, fathers in short-sleeved button shirts checking their watches, children tugging at hands, the whole rhythm of the place shifting from the looser, slower current of early afternoon into something with a bit more forward momentum. There is a designated seating area near one of the side entrances, a cluster of vinyl-cushioned benches arranged around several tall ashtray stands, the kind with a sand-filled metal dish on top, and even from a short distance you can see the thin grey ribbons rising from 2 or 3 lit cigarettes, a small huddle of adults sitting there in conversation, shopping bags resting against their legs, taking a break from the gentle, relentless churn of the building around them. It is worth remembering, if you did not live through this particular decade yourself, that smoking indoors in a public building like this one was simply unremarkable in 1978, an ordinary feature of an ordinary Saturday rather than anything anyone thought twice about. The smell of it mingling, not entirely unpleasantly, with the popcorn and the perfume counter, and the chlorinated tang drifting up faintly from the fountain. A security guard makes his unhurried way past, the same one, it turns out, who patrols this same loop nearly every weekend, recognizable by now to most of the regular teenage population of the mall, a heavy-set man somewhere in his 50s whose job seems to consist mostly of walking slowly and nodding at people, and occasionally, with real but mild authority, telling a cluster of younger boys to stop running near the fountain. He has, over the past several years, developed a kind of low-grade, informal fame among the teenagers who treat this building as their unofficial second home, known by a nickname nobody can quite remember the origin of, treated with a strange mixture of mild fear and genuine affection, the closest thing this entire indoor world has to a recurring authority figure who is neither a parent nor a teacher nor an employer. Donna nudges her toward the window of the bigger department store at the far end, where a small collection of formal dresses has been arranged on mannequins for what the sign describes as the upcoming season. Full skirts in pale blue and dusty rose, the kind of dress that will, in a matter of months, become the subject of weeks of agonizing decision-making once prom season properly arrives. They stand there for a long moment, not speaking, simply looking, each of them quietly inserting herself into one dress or another, imagining a version of herself standing in a gymnasium somewhere transformed for one night, with crepe paper streamers and a rented disco ball, a version of the future that feels, from here, both thrillingly close and impossibly far away at the same time. The strange, specific vertigo of being 16 and trying to picture 17. I want to mention something here about time itself, the way it moves differently inside a building like this one, because I think it is the single truest thing anyone could tell you about what made the mall feel the way it felt. Outside, in the actual world, the afternoon would have been measured in errands completed, chores still waiting, a clock on the kitchen wall ticking steadily toward whatever obligation came next. In here, none of that exists. There is no clock visible anywhere in this entire building, a detail so deliberate, so carefully engineered into the original design, that it stops being a coincidence the moment you notice it and start looking for one. Time, inside the mall, simply expands to fill whatever space is given to it, stretching itself across an entire Saturday afternoon without ever once announcing how much of it has already passed. That music drifting down from speakers neither girl has ever once looked up to locate has its own surprisingly deliberate history, one worth pausing on for a moment now that the afternoon has slowed enough to make room for it. The company responsible for most of what plays in buildings exactly like this one was founded decades earlier, originally built around piping music into elevators, of all places, back when elevators were new enough and unsettling enough that passengers reportedly needed something to calm their nerves during the ride. By the 1970s, the same basic idea, calm, unobtrusive, carefully engineered sound, had expanded into something close to a science, with research departments studying exactly how tempo and orchestration affected the mood and even the spending behavior of people moving through retail spaces, adjusting the pace of the music subtly across the course of a single day, slower and gentler in quieter morning hours, marginally more upbeat as the afternoon crowd thickened, though never so upbeat that anyone would consciously register a change. There is something almost unsettling about that when you really sit with it, and something almost touching at the same time. An entire profession existed, invisible to nearly everyone it was designed to influence, devoted to the careful scientific management of how relaxed or alert a shopper felt while walking past a window display. And yet the actual effect on an ordinary 16-year-old on an ordinary Saturday was simply a kind of ambient ease, a sense that this building wanted nothing from her in this particular moment, that she could simply exist inside it without being hurried along by anything sharper than a string arrangement she would never be able to name the original song underneath. They find a bench finally, somewhere along the quieter stretch between the bookstore and a shuttered storefront that has been empty, as far as either of them can remember, for as long as they have been coming here, a paper sign taped to the inside of its dark window promising a new tenant coming soon, a promise that has apparently been sitting there unfulfilled for at least a year. Donna kicks off one shoe and rubs at her heel, complaining about a blister that has been building all afternoon, and for a few minutes neither of them says very much at all, simply sitting watching the slow current of other people pass by, content in the specific, comfortable silence that only exists between two people who have known each other long enough not to need constant conversation to feel close. It is a strange thing to admit, but some of the deepest, simplest pleasure of an afternoon like this one lives precisely in moments like this, the unremarkable in-between stretches that nobody would think to mention if you asked her, years later, what she remembers about being 16. Not the boy in the record store, not the mood ring or the photo booth, or even the dress in the window she will probably never actually own. Just this, a bench, a blister, a friend beside her, quiet for a while, in a building designed in every visible way to make quiet feel comfortable rather than awkward. They are still sitting there, mostly recovered, when her own mother appears, unexpectedly, coming out of the very department store they had wandered through earlier, a single shopping bag swinging from one hand. There is a small comic awkwardness to running into your own mother inside a building you have spent the entire afternoon treating as your own private, independent territory. A brief recalibration in both directions, her mother adjusting instantly from off-duty errand runner back into the slightly more watchful posture of parent, she herself adjusting from independent 16-year-old back into daughter, if only for the 90 seconds or so that the conversation lasts. Her mother asks, predictably, whether they have eaten anything, whether Donna's brother is still planning to pick them up at 4, whether she remembered to bring the $5 left on the kitchen counter that morning, which she had in fact completely forgotten about, and now produces from the bottom of her bag with a small flush of relief. It is, in its own quiet way, a sweet little collision of two separate, parallel afternoons that happened to be unfolding inside the exact same building. Her mother had come for thread and a new set of measuring cups, and had ended up, by her own slightly embarrassed admission, trying on a hat she had absolutely no intention of buying, just to see. and there is a brief flash of something almost like recognition passing between mother and daughter. The understanding, never stated outright, that both of them had spent part of this same Saturday afternoon doing more or less the same thing, drifting, browsing, trying on a version of themselves they were not necessarily planning to take home. Her mother kisses the top of her head, tells her to be home by 5:30 for dinner, and continues on her own way, disappearing into the slow current of the corridor, leaving behind only the faint, familiar smell of her perfume, a different scent entirely from the pink bottle in the drugstore. Something older, more settled, that has simply always meant mother for as long as she can remember. There is a shoe store 2 doors further down that they had passed earlier without stopping, and now, with the $5 rescued from the bottom of her bag, and a genuine need for new school shoes looming somewhere in the back of her mind, they finally go in. It smells, the moment the door swings shut behind them, distinctly of leather and the particular chemical tang of rubber soles. A smell utterly unlike anything else in the building so far, almost old-fashioned compared to the candy and perfume and electronic warble of everywhere else they have wandered. A clerk with a metal foot measuring device kneels in front of a row of low padded benches, sliding the device gently against a small child's foot a few seats down while the child's mother waits, visibly tired, checking her own watch. She does not actually buy anything here either. In the end, the $5 proving not quite enough for the shoes she actually wants and not worth spending on the ones she does not. But there is something satisfying anyway in simply trying on 3 or 4 pairs, walking the short padded carpet runway laid down the center aisle specifically for this purpose, checking her reflection in the angled mirror at floor level that lets you see your own feet from an unfamiliar, slightly elevated angle. The clerk, patient in the particular way that clerks working with teenagers on a Saturday have learnt to be patient, says nothing about the lack of a sale, simply boxes the unchosen pairs back up and slides them back onto their shelves, already moving toward the next customer waiting. It is the unmistakable change in the quality of foot traffic, more than any clock she finally consults on a stranger's wrist near the shoe store entrance, that tells her the afternoon is genuinely drawing to a close. The casual browsers thin out, the dinner crowd thickens, families now arriving in earnest for early reservations at the one proper restaurant tucked near the far anchor store, fathers loosening ties they wore for some other obligation earlier in the day, children whining gently about wanting to go home. It is nearly 4. Donna checks the stranger's watch too, makes a small startled sound, and the two of them begin, without quite deciding to out loud, the familiar slow drift back toward the entrance where they came in nearly 5 hours ago. An afternoon that felt, somehow, both endless and like it had lasted no time at all. They pass, on the way out, almost everywhere they had already been. The record store now slightly busier than it was that morning. A different cluster of boys gathered near the new releases. The boutique with its rebellious volume of music still thumping faintly through its open doorway, the fountain still rising and falling in its same patient, programmed rhythm regardless of who comes and goes around it. There is something almost cinematic about walking back through an entire afternoon in reverse. A kind of small private montage that nobody else around her could possibly recognize as significant. Each storefront triggering some small flicker of what had happened there only hours earlier. Donna's brother is exactly where he said he would be, leaning against the hood of the car in the parking lot, a transistor radio balanced on the roof beside him, playing something with that same insistent disco bass line that seems to have colonized every station in town this year. Sunglasses pushed up into his hair even though the afternoon light has already begun its long, slow slide toward gold. He does not ask how the day went exactly, just grunts something that might be a greeting and climbs back into the driver's seat, though there is a faint, almost imperceptible softening in his usual older brother irritation, the small mercy of someone who has clearly had an easier afternoon of his own, lingering somewhere unaccounted for, possibly near the record store, possibly somewhere with friends of his own, his version of the exact same freedom his sister and her friend have just spent the day enjoying. The drive home takes on a different texture entirely from the drive over. the light now slanting low and orange through the car windows, throwing long warm shadows across the dashboard. The radio still playing, nobody quite as talkative now as they had been on the way in. A comfortable, slightly tired quiet settling over the whole car. She watches the parking lot recede in the side mirror, the enormous building shrinking gradually behind them until it is just a low shape on the horizon again. Then a sign, then nothing at all, swallowed back into the ordinary landscape of strip malls and gas stations and the long flat road leading back toward home. There is a particular feeling that settles into a person at the end of a day like this one, somewhere between satisfaction and a small, hard-to-name wistfulness. The sense of an afternoon well spent that is nonetheless already over, already beginning its slow transformation from something happening into something merely remembered. She does not have language for that feeling yet, not really, not at 16, riding in the back seat of someone else's car, with a mood ring slowly cooling back toward its resting color on her finger, and a small folded photo strip tucked safely into the front pocket of her bag. She just feels it, vaguely, the way you feel the temperature dropping a few degrees as the sun gets lower, without quite registering the cause. Dinner that evening is ordinary in every way that matters, the kind of ordinary that, decades later, becomes precisely the thing people find themselves missing most without ever being able to explain exactly why. Her father is already at the table when she walks in, tie loosened, the newspaper folded beside his plate the way it always is, glancing up just long enough to ask, in the easy, half-attentive way fathers of this particular era tended to ask, whether she had a good time, accepting her one-word answer, fine, as a complete and satisfying response, already returning his attention to whatever story he had been reading before she came in. Her mother sets a casserole dish down in the center of the table, something with noodles and ground beef and a crust of crushed potato chips on top, a recipe clipped years ago from the back of a soup can label, and never once questioned since. Her younger brother complains about the casserole, the way he complains about every casserole, and is told, the way he is told every single time, to eat it anyway, and the familiar rhythm of this exact argument, word for word nearly identical to versions of itself that have played out at this same table dozens of times before, is somehow deeply comforting rather than tedious. A small fixed point in a day that has otherwise been full of new things, new smells, new feelings she does not yet have full names for. She tells them when asked a heavily abridged version of the afternoon, the mood ring, the photo booth, leaving out entirely the boy in the record store, leaving out the small, careful social arithmetic that ran underneath nearly every minute of it. Because some things, even at 16, you already understand belong only to you, not to be handed over across a dinner table along with the casserole dish. After dinner, dishes done, her mother's hands red from the hot water, she retreats finally to her own bedroom, the door clicking shut behind her with the particular satisfying sound of a door that fits its frame slightly imperfectly and has to be pulled with just the right amount of force. She empties her bag out onto the bedspread, the small accumulated evidence of the afternoon spreading out across the quilt, the mood ring already returned to its cool resting blue now that it has been off her finger and sitting loose in the bottom of her bag for the past hour, the tiny pot of lip gloss Donna had insisted she also needed and had bought for her as a small unprompted gift near the end of the afternoon, the sample vial of perfume, the folded half of the photo strip, 4 small grainy faces looking back up at her from the quilt. She arranges these objects carefully on top of her dresser, a small private museum of a single ordinary Saturday, the kind of curation that means absolutely nothing to anyone else in the world and everything to her. At this exact moment, at 16, the phone rings downstairs almost exactly 40 minutes after dinner ends, and she does not need to ask who it is, thundering down the stairs again in her socks to answer it on the 4th ring, the same as always, because of course it is Donna, calling to debrief the entire afternoon one more time, even though they spent every minute of it standing directly beside each other, because there is apparently no limit to how many times 2 16-year-old girls can discuss the exact same 5 hours and still find something new to say about them. By the time she hangs up the phone for the second time that evening, Her family has settled into the living room for the particular Saturday night ritual that defines nearly every household on this entire street. The television glowing in the corner, her father in his usual chair, her mother with a basket of mending balanced on her lap, half watching, half working, the way she always does, never quite able to sit through an entire evening without her hands occupied by something useful. There is a variety show on, the kind built around a rotating cast of singers and comedians, and the occasional surprisingly earnest dance number, broadcast live or close enough to live, that the small imperfections, a missed cue, a slightly flat note, never get edited out, lending the whole thing a charm that feels, even to her, a little different from the more polished entertainment that will eventually replace it. She sits on the floor in front of the television rather than on the couch, leaning back against her mother's knees, half watching the screen and half still replaying pieces of the afternoon in her head, the way you do on the night of a day that felt, even without any single dramatic event inside it, somehow fuller than most. Her younger brother lies sprawled on the carpet nearby, supposedly doing homework, the textbook open and entirely ignored beside him. This is simply what Saturday night looks like, this exact arrangement of bodies in this exact room, and it will look more or less like this for years yet, though none of them sitting here tonight has any particular reason to suspect that it will not. Eventually, somewhere past 9, she excuses herself, climbs the stairs back to her room, and begins the slow nightly process of getting ready for bed, washing her face at the bathroom sink with a bar of soap that smells faintly of almonds, brushing her teeth, returning to her room to change into the soft, slightly worn nightgown she has had for 2 summers now and refuses, despite her mother's gentle suggestions, to replace. The small museum of objects from the afternoon is still sitting on her dresser exactly where she left it, and she pauses there for a moment in the lamplight, looking at each piece again, the mood ring, the lip gloss, the photo strip, before sliding the photo strip carefully into the corner of the mirror frame, the same spot it will occupy, slowly yellowing for years to come. She climbs into bed, pulls the chain on her bedside lamp, and lies there for a few minutes in the dark, the house settling into its familiar nighttime creaks and ticks around her, the faint murmur of the television still drifting up faintly from downstairs, before her father finally clicks it off and the house goes properly quiet. She thinks drifting about the boy in the record store, replaying the exact wording of what he said one more time, turning it over, looking for meaning that probably is not there but that feels in the dark worth searching for anyway. And somewhere in the middle of that small private replay, sleep simply arrives, the way it tends to at 16, without warning, without ceremony, an entire eventful afternoon folding itself quietly away into the soft, undifferentiated dark of an ordinary night. I want to stay here for a moment, in this exact quiet house, this exact sleeping girl, before we go any further, because there is something I think is worth saying gently, without any urgency at all, about everything that happened to the world she fell asleep inside tonight. Not tonight, not this particular Saturday, but the whole apparatus of it, the fountain and the skylights and the record store and the boy with his careful studied disinterest, all of it, the entire ecosystem this single ordinary afternoon depended on. For roughly the next 15 years after tonight, malls like this one would continue to multiply across the country at an extraordinary pace, new ones breaking ground in nearly every growing suburb, each one slightly larger, slightly more elaborate than the last, food courts eventually consolidating into the sprawling multi-vendor arrangements we would come to think of as standard, ice rinks and movie theatres, and even, in some of the most ambitious examples built a decade or so later, amusement park rides tucked somewhere under that same enclosed, climate-controlled sky. There is a particular kind of American confidence baked into the architecture of this era, the assumption, never quite stated outright but obvious in every design decision, that this was simply how commerce would work from now on, permanently, that the mall had solved retail the way the assembly line had solved manufacturing. Sociologists, watching this all unfold, eventually gave a name to something the mall had quietly become for an entire generation of teenagers, a concept sometimes called the third place, somewhere that is neither home nor school nor work, a space belonging to none of the adults who otherwise structured your life, where you could simply exist among your peers under your own loose, self-directed authority. Donna's brother waiting in the parking lot, the security guard with his nickname and his slow patrolling loop, the unspoken rule about how long you could browse without buying, all of it, in retrospect, was the scaffolding of one of the only third places teenagers in car-dependent American suburbs had ever really been given. Churches had filled something like that role once. So, in a more limited way, had the soda fountain and the corner drugstore a generation earlier. The mall, for a while, simply became the newest version of a very old human need, and then, slowly, and then not so slowly, it began to come apart. Not all at once, not in any single dramatic collapse that anyone watching it happen at the time could have pointed to and said, "This is the moment it started ending." It happened the way most large cultural shifts happen, gradually enough that almost nobody noticed the specific turning point until they looked up one day and realized the whole landscape had already changed underneath them. Big discount stores built far larger than any mall anchor, sitting alone in their own enormous parking lots, began pulling shoppers away with lower prices and less ceremony, and then, arriving with far more force than anyone in this exact mall tonight could have begun to imagine, an entirely different way of buying things altogether, conducted not inside any building at all but through a screen, first slowly, then all at once, a website that began by selling books and grew, within barely 2 decades, into something that could deliver almost anything at all directly to your front door within a day or two. No parking lot required, no fountain, no Muzak, no boy to run into near a rack of records that by then would barely exist as a format anyone still purchased in physical form. Here is the detail that I find genuinely difficult to sit with, the one that stays with me longer than almost anything else in this whole story. The freedom this particular Saturday afternoon represented, the specific freedom of being 16 and unsupervised inside a public space full of other people, browsing together, running into each other by accident, performing small rituals of belonging in front of witnesses who actually mattered. That freedom did not simply get improved upon by whatever came after it. It got replaced by something quieter and in certain ways colder, a version of teenage independence that mostly happens now alone, in a bedroom, on a screen, where the only witnesses are strangers scattered across an entire country rather than the specific, known, recognizable cluster of other 16-year-olds who happen to be at the mall on the exact same Saturday afternoon. The browsing still happens. The trying on, in some sense, still happens, but it happens without a body in a room, without a fountain rising and falling nearby, without the small chance collision with a boy you have liked since the 3rd grade, who happens to be standing 3 aisles over at the exact same moment you are. Many of the malls built across this country in the decades following tonight did not survive into the new century in any recognizable form. Entire categories of them earned, eventually, an almost affectionate nickname among the people who study this kind of decline. Dead malls, vast empty corridors with darkened storefronts on either side, fountains drained and filled instead with decorative gravel, the skylights still letting down their same soft pooled light onto floors that nobody walks across anymore, except the occasional photographer drawn there specifically to document the strange hollow beauty of an abandoned cathedral built entirely for commerce. Some were demolished outright, their enormous parking lots eventually subdivided and sold off for warehouses or call centers or, in a detail I find quietly poetic, sometimes simply returned to fields again, the exact kind of open land they had replaced decades earlier. This particular mall, the one she fell asleep tonight having spent her whole Saturday inside, may or may not be one of the ones that survived. I genuinely do not know, and in a way it does not matter, because the version that mattered, the version with the record store, and the boutique with its rebellious volume and the security guard with his nickname, The version that existed for exactly this one Saturday in exactly this configuration was already, even on this exact night, beginning the slow process of becoming something that could only ever be remembered rather than revisited. That is true of almost everywhere if you think about it long enough. The place outlasts the version of it you actually lived inside. She will keep the photo strip for a long, long time, longer than she keeps almost anything else from this particular year. It will travel with her, tucked into different mirror frames in different bedrooms, through the rest of high school and then college and then a string of apartments she does not yet have any way of picturing tonight, slowly fading at the edges the way old photographs do, the blacks softening toward brown, the whites yellowing gently with each passing decade. Somewhere far down the road, well past the part of this story we have any business imagining in detail, she will find it again, at the bottom of a drawer, while clearing out a house for reasons that belong to an entirely different chapter of her life. And for one unguarded moment, looking at her own 16-year-old face laughing beside Donna's, she will feel the whole afternoon come rushing back. The smell of the fountain water, the cork-soled sandals, the specific gold quality of the light slanting through the car windows on the drive home, all of it arriving at once, the way memory sometimes does, faster and more completely than seems reasonable for 4 small grainy photographs that cost nothing more than a few quarters and 20 minutes of her time. Let me back up for a moment, away from where this story is headed, and towards something her own grandmother used to talk about, because I think it gives the whole afternoon a context that is easy to miss if you only ever look forward from tonight rather than backward as well. Her grandmother grew up in this same town a full generation earlier, in the years before any mall existed anywhere nearby, when shopping meant something entirely different, a walk or a streetcar ride into the actual center of town, a main street lined with individual shops, each one owned by someone whose name you actually knew, a butcher who remembered exactly how your family liked its roast cut, a dry goods store where the owner kept a running account in a ledger under the counter because half his customers paid him only once a month, on payday, and he trusted them to do it. Her grandmother still talks about that main street sometimes, usually with a particular warmth that the granddaughter at 16 finds a little hard to fully picture, since the main street her grandmother describes barely exists anymore in any of the same form. Half its storefronts dark now, the businesses that remain mostly the kind that cannot easily be replicated inside a mall, a hardware store perhaps, or an insurance office, the rest having either closed outright or relocated years ago into exactly the kind of building her granddaughter spent this entire Saturday wandering through. There is no villain in this particular story, no single bad decision anyone could point to and blame. It was simply gravity. The slow, steady pull of a population spreading outward into new subdivisions built on what used to be farmland, of cars making distance feel cheap in a way it had never felt cheap before, of one enclosed, climate-controlled building managing to offer, under a single unified roof, everything that used to require an entire walk down an entire street to assemble. What her grandmother lost in that shift, and she does talk about it as a loss, gently, without much bitterness but unmistakably as a loss, was something that the mall, for all its genuine charm, was never quite built to replace. The butcher who knew her name, the dry goods owner who trusted her with credit because he had watched her family pay its bills faithfully for 15 years running, a version of commerce that was personal in a way that scaled to maybe a few thousand people and simply could not survive the arrival of anything larger. The mall offered her granddaughter something wonderful tonight, a fountain, a record store, a boy worth noticing, an entire safe afternoon of independence. It is also quietly the very same structure that finished off the world her grandmother grew up inside. The two things bound together so completely that you cannot really celebrate one without acknowledging what it cost the other. I think about this kind of thing more than is probably useful, the way every single comfort we build for ourselves seems to require dismantling some earlier comfort to make room for it. The main street her grandmother loved gave way to the mall her granddaughter loves tonight. And the mall itself, as we have already wandered through together, would eventually give way to something else again. A screen, a doorstep delivery, a different shape of convenience that her granddaughter, decades from now, will find herself describing to her own children with the exact same gentle, slightly wistful tone her grandmother uses right now to describe Main Street. Nothing here is static. Nothing ever really was. Every generation gets exactly one version of convenience to fall in love with, and exactly one version of loss to eventually mourn quietly once the next thing arrives to replace it. Back at her own bedroom dresser tonight, none of that is on her mind at all, of course. She is simply asleep, the small museum of mood ring and lip gloss and photo strip sitting undisturbed in the lamp's soft residual glow, the house around her settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, her parents' bedroom door closed at the end of the hall, her brother's radio finally switched off down the other end of the house. It is just an ordinary Tuesday quiet kind of Saturday night, indistinguishable on the surface from dozens of others that came before it and dozens more that will follow, and that, I think, is exactly the point worth sitting with. The most ordinary nights are so often the ones that turn out, decades later, to have been the ones worth keeping. There is a wall in her bedroom just above the headboard that nobody but her ever really looks at carefully, papered over the past 2 years with torn-out magazine pages, the soft glossy kind, faces of singers and one particular television actor whose poster has occupied the most prominent spot for nearly 8 months now. A small shrine assembled entirely from a stack of monthly magazines marketed specifically and unapologetically toward girls exactly her age, full of breathless captions about which star secretly loves long walks on the beach and which one is, according to an interview conducted apparently over the telephone, looking for a girl who is just herself. Nobody who wrote those captions had any particular interest in honesty. Everyone reading them understood that completely, and bought the magazine again the very next month anyway, because the pleasure was never really in believing it. The pleasure was in the specific, cozy ritual of imagining it together with every other girl, reading the exact same words in bedrooms scattered across the entire country that same week. Monday morning 3 days from now, though she does not yet know precisely how it will unfold, will bring its own small reckoning, the unofficial trading of weekend news that happens in hallways and homeroom, and the 5 minutes before the bell, where this entire Saturday will get compressed, retold, slightly exaggerated in places, slightly understated in others, depending on who she is telling and what she judges they need or deserve to hear. The boy in the record store will get mentioned to exactly one other person besides Donna, a girl 2 lockers down whose discretion she trusts completely, in a hushed, urgent exchange conducted at a volume calibrated specifically to be audible to her and inaudible to absolutely anyone else passing by. This is its own kind of currency, this careful curation of who gets which version of the story, a skill she has been developing since middle school, without ever once being taught it directly by anyone. I find something quietly remarkable in how durable this particular human behavior turns out to be, watching it from this far outside it. Long before any of this, and long after it too, informs her 16-year-old self could not begin to picture tonight, people would keep doing some version of exactly this, retelling an ordinary outing to people who were not there, shaping it slightly in the telling, deciding who deserved the complete version and who only deserved the highlights. The mechanism never really goes anywhere. Only the format keeps shifting underneath it, hallway whispers becoming, decades later, something posted and broadcast all at once to everyone she knows simultaneously, the careful curation collapsing down into something faster and far less private, though I suspect if you asked her, the version conducted quietly between 2 lockers felt, at the time, like the realest one there could possibly be. Picture, just for a moment, what that same mall looks like tonight. Hours after she has already gone to sleep, long after the last shoppers have wandered out and the security guard with his nickname has made his final unhurried loop and locked the doors behind him, the lights dim down to a low security setting, most of the corridor falling into a soft blue dimness broken only by the faint glow of a few display windows left illuminated overnight. The fountain switches off automatically on a timer, the water settling into stillness, the surface eventually going completely flat and silent in a way it never once was during the entire crowded, noisy afternoon. The Muzak stops. The escalators, if this particular mall has any, power down and sit motionless, their steel teeth locked in place mid-ascent. There is something almost eerie about an empty mall at 2 in the morning, all that careful, deliberate engineering toward ease and distraction and gentle disorientation, sitting now in total silence, waiting for the doors to open again at 10 the next morning, and the whole elaborate machinery of it to start humming back to life. There is something almost touching about picturing those two stillnesses side by side, though neither one has anything at all to do with the other. The mall miles away, sitting dark and silent under its own vaulted skylights, the fountain motionless, the corridors empty except for whatever faint hum the air conditioning still makes even at its lowest overnight setting. And here, in this particular house, on this particular street, a 16-year-old girl breathing slowly and evenly under a quilt that smells faintly of fabric softener, a mood ring cooling on her dresser, a photo strip tucked into the corner of a mirror that will, very gradually, over years she cannot yet imagine, begin to curl and yellow at its edges, both of them resting now, both of them waiting, without quite knowing it, for tomorrow to arrive and ask something different of them. Outside, the neighborhood has settled into the particular quiet that suburban streets settle into on a Saturday night in late summer. Crickets going steadily somewhere in the grass along the property line, the occasional distant hum of a car passing 2 streets over, a porch light left on by some neighbor a few houses down, that nobody will think to switch off until Sunday morning. It is the kind of night that asks nothing of anyone, warm enough that a few bedroom windows up and down the block are cracked open an inch or two, just enough to let in air that still carries, faintly, the smell of someone's lawn mowed earlier that afternoon, and somebody else's charcoal grill, long since gone cold, sitting out on a back patio waiting to be cleaned in the morning. It is worth remembering lightly, without making too much of it, that this is a country in the late 1970s still working its way through the lingering unease of an energy crisis just a few years behind it. Gas lines and thermostats turned down a few degrees lower than people would have liked. A general sense, hovering somewhere in the background of ordinary life, that the easy abundance of the previous decade or two could not simply be assumed to continue forever. None of that touched this particular Saturday in any direct way. The car had enough gas in it for the drive to the mall and back. The air conditioning inside ran exactly the way it always had, but it sits there anyway, underneath everything. A kind of low background hum of national uncertainty that adults of this era carried with them even into otherwise ordinary afternoons. An uncertainty that a 16-year-old, absorbed completely in a mood ring and a boy's half-remembered sentence, has the genuine luxury of not yet needing to think about at all. In the kitchen downstairs, after everyone else has gone up, her mother is the last one still awake, wiping down the counter one final time, setting out cereal boxes for the morning, glancing at the small calendar pinned to the side of the refrigerator to confirm what needs doing tomorrow. There is a specific, quiet competence in the way she moves through this final pass of the kitchen, the same competence that planned the casserole and remembered the $5 on the counter, and managed, somehow, to also find 20 minutes that same afternoon to try on a hat she had no intention of buying. Households like this one ran, in this era, almost entirely on this kind of invisible, undocumented labor, performed faithfully every single night by women who would not, for the most part, have described what they were doing as anything particularly noteworthy. It was simply Tuesday. It was simply Saturday. It was simply what needed doing before the house could properly go to sleep. She switches off the kitchen light last of all, and the house settles finally into full and complete darkness. Every member of this particular family now somewhere in their own bed, the day fully closed behind them, tomorrow not yet begun. I think there is something worth sitting with, here at the edge of sleep, about how strange it is that a single ordinary Saturday like this one can hold so much inside it without announcing any of it as important while it is actually happening. Nothing dramatic occurred today. Nobody's life changed direction. No single moment, examined on its own, would qualify as a story worth telling anyone, and yet stack enough of these unremarkable afternoons together, the mood rings and the photo booths and the careful conversations near record store shelves, and you get, eventually, something that looks an awful lot like an entire childhood, an entire adolescence, the specific unrepeatable texture of growing up in one particular town in one particular decade that will never quite exist again in exactly that configuration. Maybe that is true of whatever night you are having right now too, wherever you happen to be listening to this from. Maybe today did not feel especially significant either, just an ordinary stretch of hours that you moved through the way you move through most days, errands and small obligations, and a handful of conversations that will not, on their own, earn a place in any story you tell about your life later. And maybe that is exactly the quiet comfort worth taking from this whole long Saturday we just spent together. The ordinary days are not the in-between parts of a life, waiting around for the meaningful ones to arrive. They are most of what a life actually is when you add them all up. They are the part that decades from now, somebody somewhere will find themselves missing more than they could have predicted. The casserole and the complaint about the casserole, the phone ringing on the fourth ring, the particular quality of light through a particular set of curtains on one particular forgettable afternoon. There is no need to do anything with that thought tonight. No need to hold on to it, examine it, turn it over for meaning the way she turned over that boy's half-remembered sentence in the dark. Just let it sit there, quietly, the way most true things sit best when you are this close to sleep, unfinished, unresolved, not asking anything of you at all. If you ever did visit a mall like this one, at any point in your own life, in any town, in any decade, some version of what we walked through tonight probably brushed up against something real in your own memory somewhere along the way. A fountain you used to sit near, a record store you used to linger in far longer than you ever intended to, a friend whose voice on the phone could turn an ordinary Saturday into something worth getting dressed up for. Some of those buildings are still standing, busier than ever in places, having found new life as something else entirely. Churches now occupying former department stores, indoor go-kart tracks where a boutique used to play its music too loud, community colleges holding classes in spaces that once sold lava lamps and mood rings by the register. Others sit mostly empty now, their parking lots cracked and weedy, waiting for whatever comes next. Whether that is demolition or some unlikely second act, nobody has quite figured out how to write for them yet. And some of them, the lucky ones, in towns that manage to hold on to enough of their original draw, simply continue on, quieter than they used to be, the food court a little less crowded, the record store long since replaced by something selling phone cases and cheap sunglasses, but the fountain still there, still rising and falling on the same patient, programmed rhythm it always has, still catching coins thrown in by children who have absolutely no idea that their own grandparents once stood in roughly that exact same spot, at roughly that exact same age, doing precisely the same small, hopeful thing. Maybe she is right now, in whatever year you happen to be listening to this from, somewhere in her 60s, the exact mood ring long since lost or thrown away decades ago without much ceremony, the photo strip either lost along with it or still tucked somewhere safe, in a drawer, in a box of old photographs nobody has properly sorted through since her own mother passed. Maybe Donna is still her closest friend, the two of them having weathered marriages and moves and the ordinary erosion that thins out most friendships over 40 years, still calling each other occasionally, though no longer on a wall-mounted phone with a cord stretched into the pantry. Maybe they lost touch decades ago, the way most teenage friendships eventually do. No falling out, no single moment you could point to. Just distance and time and different lives, slowly pulling two people apart who once thought nothing could ever come between them. Or perhaps the mall itself is gone now, demolished sometime in the 2000s, the land beneath it repurposed into something flatter and less ambitious. A strip of big box stores arranged around their own separate parking lots, no shared roof connecting any of them, no fountain, No Muzak, no architectural attempt whatsoever at recreating anything resembling a town square. Or maybe it is still standing, smaller feeling than she remembers, the record store and the boutique long since replaced by a vitamin shop and a phone repair counter, the building itself outliving nearly everything that originally gave it meaning, the way buildings so often do, indifferent shells standing patiently over whatever new purpose eventually moves in to fill them. None of that matters very much right now. On this particular Saturday night we have spent together, with her sound asleep upstairs and the house gone properly dark and quiet around her. Whatever became of the mall, whatever became of Donna, whatever became of the boy in the record store, whose name and face have, by the time she reaches 60, almost certainly faded into something soft and unspecific in her memory, none of it changes what tonight actually was while it was happening. An ordinary Saturday, a mood ring, a fountain rising and falling in a rhythm someone programmed to look spontaneous, a best friend's voice on the phone, urgent and delighted, over absolutely nothing important at all. I think that is, in the end, the truest thing this whole story has to offer you tonight, somewhere on the edge of your own sleep, in whatever room you happen to be lying in right now. The things that felt biggest at the time rarely turn out to be the things that last. It is the small, unremarkable textures that stay, the ones nobody thought to treat as significant while they were actually unfolding. A particular smell near a particular fountain, the specific sound cork-soled sandals make against tile, a phone ringing on the fourth ring, every single time, because that is simply how long it always took to get down the stairs. There is one more stop worth mentioning from that long Saturday afternoon, one we skipped past earlier without quite stopping there properly, because I think it deserves a slower look now that the night has settled in around her, and there is nowhere left to rush toward. Tucked between the bookstore and a small luggage shop that never seems to have a single customer in it, there is an appliance and electronics store, the kind that sells televisions stacked in a wall display all tuned to the same channel, console stereos large enough to double as furniture, and, occupying a single demonstration unit near the front window, something genuinely new that her own household does not yet own, a home video game console that connects directly to the family television set, sold in a box just over a year old, the screen showing a simple game of tennis rendered in two blocky white rectangles, batting a single square dot back and forth across a black background. Donna's brother had actually lingered there earlier on the way out, watching a boy a few years younger than them work the included paddle controller with real concentration. And there is something worth pausing on in that image, a living room console game arriving into ordinary American households for the first time in any real volume, the earliest visible edge of an entertainment shift that would, within a couple of decades, restructure how an enormous number of teenagers spent their evenings, gradually pulling at least some portion of that unsupervised social wandering she spent her whole afternoon enjoying back into individual living rooms, individual screens, a different, quieter, more solitary kind of leisure that nobody standing in this electronics store today has any way of anticipating yet. I think it is worth saying something here about how deliberately this entire afternoon, every store in it, had been built around the specific existence of a teenage shopper as a category worth designing for in the first place, because it was not always assumed that way. The very idea of the teenager as a distinct consumer, someone with her own money, her own taste, her own purchasing habits separate from her parents, is a surprisingly recent invention in the long history of American retail, really only crystallizing as a marketing concept in the years just after the Second World War, when advertisers and retailers, looking at a growing population of young people with part-time jobs and modest but real disposable income, began deliberately building entire product lines, magazines, music genres, and eventually entire stores specifically around her rather than around her parents. Before that, clothing and music and leisure were largely scaled down or scaled up versions of what adults already consumed. The teenager as her own market, her own customer, her own carefully studied demographic, is barely older than her own mother. She herself, of course, has no particular awareness of any of this while standing in front of that television tennis game earlier in the afternoon, watching the little white square bounce back and forth with a flat electronic blip each time it strikes a paddle. She simply finds it a little strange and a little wonderful. The same reaction, more or less, that an entire generation just slightly older than her would have had a few years earlier the first time anyone showed them a transistor radio small enough to carry in one hand. Every era gets exactly one or two machines that briefly feel like a glimpse of the actual future before they settle quietly into the background of ordinary life and stop feeling remarkable at all. It is worth pausing too on the actual money involved in an afternoon like this one, because the numbers themselves carry a kind of texture that statistics alone rarely manage to convey. She came to the mall today with $11, most of it earned babysitting the neighbor's two younger children most Friday evenings for the past several weeks. The remainder a small contribution from her mother specifically earmarked, with the unspoken understanding that mothers are very good at communicating without ever quite stating outright, for something sensible rather than something silly. Babysitting paid in this particular town in 1978, somewhere around 75 cents an hour, occasionally stretching to a full dollar if the children in question were especially difficult or especially numerous. Money handed over directly in cash at the end of the night by a grateful, slightly frazzled parent heading out the door for one of their own rare evenings of freedom. $11, against that backdrop, was real money. Money that took several Friday evenings of mostly quiet, occasionally chaotic supervision to accumulate, and she spent almost none of it today in any single decisive purchase, parceling it out instead across a lip gloss Donna insisted on buying for her, a mood ring costing less than $2, the orange drink at the fountain, small fractional spending spread thin across an entire afternoon rather than concentrated into one meaningful object she could point to afterward and say, "This is what I bought today." That is, in its own way, exactly how a mall this size wanted her money spent. Not in one large, satisfying purchase, but in a dozen small, frictionless ones, each individually too modest to feel like a real decision. The kind of spending that adds up, almost without anyone noticing, into a genuinely significant afternoon of commerce conducted by someone who would tell you, completely sincerely, that she barely bought anything at all today. Later in the evening, somewhere in the gap between dinner and the variety show, there had been a brief half-serious conversation between her and Donna about the roller rink across town, a low flat building with a parking lot of its own, packed every Friday and Saturday night with a slightly older crowd than theirs, the entire interior built around a polished wooden floor, and a sound system loud enough to feel in your chest, disco lights spinning slow-coloured patterns across the walls, while a steady stream of skaters circled the floor in loose, ever-shifting formation. Some couples skating hand in hand in the careful, practiced rhythm of people who have done this together many times before, others alone, weaving in and out, showing off in the specific, understated way that skilled skaters always seem to manage without appearing to try. The roller rink occupies a slightly different social register than the mall does. A little later at night, a little more explicitly romantic in its purpose. The kind of place where a couple skating the slow song together is understood by absolutely everyone present to mean something, in a way that simply standing near each other in a record store does not quite carry the same weight. She has been twice this year already, both times with Donna, both times spending more of the evening watching than actually skating. Her ankles never quite steady enough on the rented skates to fully relax into the rhythm the more experienced regulars seem to find effortless. Maybe next month, she tells Donna, she will actually learn properly. Maybe Donna agrees, in the particular tone of two people who have made this exact promise to each other several times already and have not yet, in fact, gotten around to it. Her own outfit, chosen that morning, the wide-leg jeans and the peasant blouse with its small embroidered flowers, sits at an interesting crossroads in the broader fashion story of this particular decade, one worth untangling a little now that there is time for it. The first half of the 1970s had belonged almost entirely to a looser, more bohemian silhouette, bell-bottoms flaring dramatically from the knee down, fabrics patterned in paisley and floral prints borrowed loosely from a hippie aesthetic that had, by this point, drifted well outside its original countercultural origins and settled comfortably into ordinary suburban closets everywhere. Platform shoes, sometimes absurdly tall, had briefly made nearly everyone a few inches taller than nature intended, men included, a trend so visually extreme in retrospect that it tends to dominate almost every photograph taken of this decade, regardless of how unrepresentative platforms actually were of most ordinary daily footwear. By 1978 specifically, something had started shifting underneath all of that. A slow move toward the sleeker, more form-fitting silhouette that disco culture had been quietly popularizing in nightclubs for the past couple of years, and that would, within another year or two, fully take over mainstream fashion entirely. Narrower trousers, fitted blouses, an overall design language considerably less loose and flowing than what had dominated just a few years earlier. Her own peasant blouse, in that sense, was already starting to feel slightly dated to the more fashion-forward girls at school, the ones who had already moved on to the sleeker designer jean silhouette Donna had been admiring earlier, though she herself remained, for now, mostly unbothered by that particular hierarchy, comfortable enough in her own slightly out-of-step taste that the social cost of it never quite registered as a real cost at all. There is a charge account too somewhere behind nearly everything purchased today, even the items that were paid for in cash, in the sense that the entire department store anchoring one end of the mall operates on a credit system her own parents have maintained an account with for years, a small embossed plastic card kept in her mother's wallet that allows charges to be made against a running monthly balance, paid off in their household's case faithfully and in full every single month, though plenty of households in this exact town carry a balance from month to month instead, paying a modest finance charge for the privilege of spreading larger purchases out over time. The concept itself, store credit extended directly to a trusted customer rather than routed through a bank, had been a fixture of American department store retail for the better part of a century by this point. The charge card her mother carries simply the latest, slightly more standardized version of an arrangement that in her own grandmother's era would have been recorded by hand in a ledger kept under the counter, the exact same trust relationship dressed up now in embossed plastic and a small paper receipt instead of a clerk's careful handwriting. One more piece of invisible infrastructure underneath this entire Saturday deserves a slower look before we let the night close in fully around her. And it is something so completely taken for granted by everyone walking through that mall today that almost nobody would think to mention it at all. Air conditioning, the steady, cool, faintly metallic breath that hit her the moment those front doors slid open this morning, is a technology barely a few decades into genuinely widespread residential and commercial use by 1978. And its arrival reshaped American life, particularly life across the warmer half of the country, far more profoundly than people tend to credit it for. Entire regions that had once emptied out every summer, businesses closing early, families retreating to porches and basements and lake houses to escape afternoon heat that made indoor commerce nearly unbearable for months at a stretch, had been transformed within a single generation into places where a person could comfortably shop, work, and gather indoors through the hottest part of the year without much discomfort at all. The enclosed shopping mall, the very form this entire Saturday has revolved around, would simply not have made sense as a concept before reliable, affordable air conditioning existed at the scale required to keep a building this large comfortable through a full summer. Victor Gruen's original Minnesota mall actually leaned into the opposite problem first, designing primarily around cold protection for a brutal Midwestern winter, but the form he invented adapted almost immediately and completely to the opposite climate need once it spread south and west, the same enclosed climate-controlled logic working equally well to keep a building cool in July as it had worked to keep it warm in January. Comfort, it turns out, was always the actual product being sold here underneath every individual item on every individual shelf. The merchandise was almost secondary to the simple, profound relief of being somewhere consistently, reliably, artificially comfortable, regardless of what the actual weather happened to be doing outside. She thinks about none of this, of course, standing in front of the cosmetics counter earlier today, or sitting on the cool tiled lip of the fountain with her orange drink. Comfort like that, when you have never known anything else, simply disappears into the background of ordinary experience, the way clean water or electric light disappears into the background for anyone fortunate enough to have grown up with it as a constant rather than a luxury. It is only much later, decades from now, hearing her own grandmother describe summers spent fanning herself on a porch through entire sweltering July afternoons with nothing else to be done about it, that she will begin to understand just how recent, how genuinely remarkable the simple fact of a cool, comfortable indoor Saturday afternoon actually was. Her father, sitting in his usual chair with a newspaper folded beside his plate, had asked only the one brief question over dinner, and there is a whole quiet history behind that particular brevity worth pausing on now, in the dark, with the house settled. He works at a plant on the edge of town that makes parts for something larger she has never fully understood the purpose of, leaving most mornings before she is properly awake and returning most evenings with a tiredness that settles into his shoulders in a way she has learned, over the years, to read accurately without needing him to say a single word about it. His questions tend to be short, not because he does not care about the answer, but because the version of fatherhood he absorbed growing up simply did not include much practice in asking longer ones. An entire generation of men taught, mostly without anyone explicitly teaching it, that providing and asking briefly and loving quietly from a slight, comfortable distance constituted a complete and respectable way of being present in a household. She does not resent this exactly, has never had reason to, since the love itself has never once felt genuinely in question, only its particular shape, a shape that looks different from the easier, chattier closeness she sometimes envies in friends whose fathers seem to talk with them more freely. He had in fact slipped her an extra $2 this morning before she left, folded small and pressed into her palm without comment, alongside the $5 her mother had already set out on the counter, a small, unspoken addition that said, in its own way, considerably more than a longer conversation might have managed. She had spent part of that extra $2 on the orange drink and the arcade without once connecting it back consciously to where it had actually come from. Her younger brother, 11 years old and still young enough to find an entire Saturday spent at the mall almost unbearably tedious, had spent his own afternoon riding his bicycle in slow loops around the neighborhood with two friends from down the street, building, by his own breathless account delivered rapid fire at the dinner table, an elaborate ramp out of scrap wood that had predictably collapsed on its second use, sending one of his friends tumbling harmlessly into the grass to general hilarity rather than injury. There is something almost touching in how completely different their two Saturdays turned out to be, while unfolding only a few miles apart, hers oriented entirely around being seen, around social arithmetic and careful proximity to a boy near a record store. His oriented entirely around scraped knees and physics experiments conducted with plywood and pure unself-conscious enthusiasm, neither version of childhood better than the other, simply occupying two completely different stages of the same long, slow process of growing up in this exact house, on this exact street, in this exact unremarkable year, tucked into the top drawer of her dresser, underneath a tangle of hair ribbons and a few loose buttons waiting to be sewn back onto things, sits last year's school yearbook, its cover already slightly bent at one corner from being pulled out and flipped through more often than its spine was really built to handle. She had taken it out just briefly before bed, the way she sometimes does on nights when the day has felt fuller than usual, paging through the candid photographs scattered between the formal class portraits, searching, half on purpose and half not, for any picture that happened to include the boy from the record store, finding exactly one, the blurred shot from a pep rally where he is visible only in profile near the edge of the frame, looking at something entirely unrelated to her. Yearbooks occupy a strange, specific place in the emotional life of a teenager in this era, less a simple record of the school year than a kind of slow-motion popularity ledger, signed in the final week of classes by dozens of classmates writing variations on the same handful of phrases. Have a great summer, stay sweet, never change. The sincerity of each message judged carefully afterward against how many lines the person actually wrote and how well she actually knows them. An entire informal social audit conducted in ballpoint pen across the white space of a few hundred printed pages. She has already started quietly looking forward to next year's edition, wondering whether this particular boy might sign hers properly this time, wondering what she might possibly find the nerve to write in his. There is something worth sitting with in this exact moment about how much of being 16 consists of this specific, suspended kind of waiting for a yearbook to be signed, waiting for a boy to say something slightly more than he said today, waiting for Monday so the whole afternoon can be properly retold, waiting in the largest sense for an adult life that feels both thrillingly close and stubbornly out of reach at the exact same time. Nobody tells you while you are actually living through that particular stretch of waiting how much of it you will eventually miss, not because any single piece of it was easy, but because the waiting itself, the not yet arrived quality of nearly everything, carried its own strange, electric kind of aliveness that gets harder to access once enough of the waiting has finally resolved into an ordinary adult life with its own different, quieter rhythms. The neighborhood she lives in, the street with its identical mailboxes and its slightly varied but fundamentally similar single-story houses, did not exist at all before 1962, built in a single sustained wave of construction across what had been, until then, open farmland on the edge of town, part of a much larger pattern repeating itself in nearly every American city and town throughout the 2.5 decades following the end of the Second World War. Returning veterans, supported by federal loan guarantees that made buying a home dramatically more accessible than it had ever been for ordinary working families before, needed somewhere to live, and developers, working at a scale and a speed that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier, answered that need by building entire towns essentially overnight, street after street of similar houses on similar lots, financed by loans that simply had not existed in this form before the war reshaped both the economy and the federal government's relationship to ordinary homeownership. None of that expansion would have functioned the way it did without an equally massive parallel investment unfolding at the same time in the roads connecting all those new houses to everywhere else, a national interstate highway system authorized in the mid-1950s and still, in places, under active construction even now in 1978, decades after it began. The exit a few miles from her house, the one Donna's brother takes every single time he drives them to the mall, simply did not exist before that system reached this particular stretch of countryside, and the mall itself, when you trace the decision backward far enough, was sited exactly where it was sited specifically because of that exit, because the people who decided where to build a building this size needed to know, with real confidence, that thousands of cars a week could reach it easily from every direction. Her own grandmother's main street, the one with the butcher who knew her name, had been built around an entirely different transportation logic. A town centre reachable on foot or by streetcar, dense and walkable because density and walkability were simply what the available transportation technology of that earlier era required. The mall represents the same basic human impulse toward gathering and commerce reorganized completely around a newer, faster, more individually mobile technology instead. Every single design decision inside that building, the size of the parking lot, the placement of the anchor stores, the width of the corridors built wide enough for crowds arriving all at once by car rather than trickling in steadily on foot, tracing directly back to decisions made in distant government offices about highway funding formulas that nobody in this mall today has ever heard of, and that shaped more completely than almost anything else the entire physical world she spent her whole Saturday wandering through. It is worth mentioning now something that nobody at the mall today said out loud, though it sat quietly underneath the whole afternoon for all of them in slightly different ways. This is the last Saturday of summer, the final completely free weekend before classes resume in just over a week, before mornings reorganize themselves around an alarm clock and a school bus schedule, rather than whatever lazy hour a body happens to wake up on its own. There is always a particular weight to that last free Saturday, heavier than any of the ordinary Saturdays that came before it across June and July, even when nobody quite articulates why, even when the day itself, examined moment by moment, looks almost exactly like a dozen other Saturdays already spent at this exact mall with this exact friend. Maybe that is part of why this one stays with her so completely in the decades that follow, longer and more vividly than the half-dozen other mall afternoons that came before it this same summer, and have already, even by tonight, begun blurring together into a single soft composite memory. Some part of her, without consciously deciding to pay closer attention, was paying closer attention anyway, registering the particular gold quality of the light, the particular weight of the mood ring settling onto her finger, the particular sound of Donna's laugh in the arcade, simply because some instinct understood that summer, this specific summer, the summer she was 16, was closing its door quietly behind her, and that everything happening today was happening for what amounted to the last time, even if next summer would bring its own version of all of it, slightly different, with a slightly different boy, and a slightly different outfit, and a slightly different fountain to sit beside. That is the part of this story I find myself returning to longest. The way an entirely unremarkable Saturday can end up carrying, underneath its surface, the quiet emotional weight of an ending nobody announced, a door closing somewhere just out of sight while everyone in the room goes on talking about mood rings and record albums, as though nothing significant is happening at all. Most real endings work exactly that way. They rarely arrive with any fanfare. They simply happen, quietly, inside an afternoon that otherwise looks like every other afternoon. And it is only much later, looking back from somewhere far enough down the road, that you are able to recognize the specific one that mattered more than it seemed to at the time. She dreams, that night, of nothing especially memorable, the way most ordinary nights of sleep tend to go, fragments rather than a story, the fountain appearing briefly, reshaped slightly by whatever strange logic dreams operate under, taller than it actually is, the water somehow falling upward instead of down, the boy from the record store present for a moment and then simply gone, replaced without explanation by an entirely unrelated scene involving her grandmother's old kitchen, a place she has not actually visited in over a year. None of it holds together the way a waking memory would. By morning she will retain almost nothing of it at all beyond a vague, pleasant sense of having dreamed something involving water and noise, and a feeling she cannot quite name, the specific privilege of a 16-year-old's deep, mostly uncomplicated sleep, untroubled by the kind of restless 3 in the morning waking that becomes more familiar with age. There is something worth noting about sleep itself at this particular stage of life, the sheer biological generosity of it, a body still growing, still building itself, demanding and receiving long uninterrupted stretches of rest that a person in her 40s or 50s will look back on with something close to genuine envy. She will fall asleep again tomorrow night, just as easily as she fell asleep tonight, and the night after that, mostly without effort, without ritual, without needing anything like the careful winding down process that becomes necessary later in life. The dimmed lights and the quiet voice and the deliberate emptying of the mind that eventually, for most people, becomes a nightly project rather than something the body simply does on its own. Perhaps that is part of why a story like this one, an ordinary Saturday revisited in this much unhurried detail, works the way it does for whoever happens to be listening tonight, decades or generations removed from the actual year it describes. It offers, in its own small way, something like borrowed access to that easier, more generous kind of sleep, a return, however briefly and however indirectly, to the particular unburdened heaviness of an adolescent body, finally allowed to simply stop, to let the whole accumulated weight of a long day settle and dissolve into nothing more demanding than dreams about water and noise that will not even be remembered by morning. There is one final thread worth pulling gently before we let this particular Saturday close completely. Years from tonight, long after the mood ring and the photo strip and even, eventually, the mall itself have become things she only describes rather than visits, she will have a daughter of her own. And that daughter, at roughly the same age, will come home from an entirely different kind of Saturday, one spent mostly on a screen in her own room, talking to friends scattered across a dozen different towns rather than walking beside just one of them through a single shared building. And she will find herself, somewhat to her own surprise, trying to explain them all to this daughter, trying to describe the fountain and the record store and the specific social arithmetic of running into a boy you liked among the album bins, watching her daughter's polite, slightly puzzled expression, the expression of someone listening to a description of a world that sounds, from the outside, both charming and faintly inconceivable. She will not manage to fully explain it. Not really. The way none of us ever quite manage to translate the specific texture of our own adolescence into terms the next generation can genuinely feel, rather than merely understand as information. Her daughter will nod, interested in the abstract way you are interested in a parent's old stories, and will then return to her own version of the exact same fundamental teenage project, building a self, testing it against an audience of peers, performing small rituals of belonging, just conducted through an entirely different set of tools than a fountain and a record store and a borrowed $5 on a kitchen counter. The mechanism underneath it all, the wanting and the watching and the careful curated telling, will have travelled forward completely intact, the way it always does, dressed in whatever new clothing each new decade happens to provide for it. And somewhere inside that future conversation with her own daughter, though she will not think to phrase it quite this way at the time, she will be doing exactly what is happening to you right now, in this exact moment, lying in your own bed in your own particular year, letting a story about somebody else's ordinary Saturday gently stand in for, and gently illuminate, some quieter corner of your own. That is in the end the only real thing any of these old afternoons are ever good for. Not nostalgia for its own sake, just a reminder delivered slowly enough and gently enough to actually land, that whatever ordinary day you are coming from tonight was in its own unannounced way exactly as full as this one was, whether you noticed it happening or not. Earlier that evening, before the dishes were even finished, she had stood for a moment at the kitchen window watching the first fireflies rise up out of the grass at the edge of the yard, blinking on and off in their slow, scattered, unhurried pattern, the kind of sight so ordinary in late summer that nobody in the house bothered to remark on it out loud. Behind that low, pulsing light, steady underneath it the way it is every single evening this time of year, came the rising drone of cicadas somewhere in the trees along the property line, a sound that builds gradually from a single distant buzz into something closer to a full chorus as the light fades, then holds there, constant, for hours before tapering off again sometime past midnight when the temperature finally drops enough to quiet them. There is something worth knowing about that sound, if you have never thought to wonder about it before. Many of the cicadas filling these particular trees this particular summer spent years underground before ever making any noise at all, some species taking as long as several years buried in the soil as nymphs, feeding slowly and patiently on root systems in complete darkness before finally emerging for one single loud, comparatively brief season above ground, just long enough to find a mate and sing the specific droning call that fills this exact backyard tonight, and then their part in the whole long cycle is finished. An entire silent, hidden childhood underground, spent for the sake of one short, audible summer. She did not know any of that standing at the window earlier, of course simply found the sound pleasant in the unthinking way you find familiar background noise pleasant, without examining why, the cicadas and the fireflies forming, together, the specific soundtrack and scenery of every late summer evening she has ever known in this house, indistinguishable in memory from one year to the next. The kind of seasonal constant that will, decades from now, instantly transport her back to exactly this porch, exactly this kitchen window, the moment she hears it again somewhere else entirely. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a house like this one once everyone inside it has finally gone quiet. different from silence in an empty house, because you can feel, somehow, the specific texture of each sleeping person within it, your own breathing slowing to match a rhythm the whole building seems to share, without anyone coordinating it. The refrigerator hums faintly from the kitchen. A floorboard somewhere settles with the soft, almost conversational creak old houses make, as the temperature drops a degree or two heading toward the coolest part of the night. None of it is loud enough to wake anyone. All of it is simply present, the small ongoing proof that a house like a body never fully stops, even while everyone inside it rests. Let yourself notice, if it helps, that same kind of quiet wherever you happen to be lying right now. Whatever small sounds your own room is making, the settling of your own walls, the distant hum of something electrical, the wind doing whatever it happens to be doing outside your particular window tonight, none of it is asking anything of you either. It is simply the sound of a place existing around you while you rest inside it, the same way that house existed around her, the same way every house holding a sleeping person inside it has always quietly continued on. Regardless of the specific decade, regardless of the specific Saturday that came right before it, you can drift now, the way she is already drifting, somewhere far behind us in this story, in a bedroom with a yellowing photograph tucked into the corner of a mirror and a mood ring slowly cooling on a dresser in the dark. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, nothing else you need to figure out or resolve before you let your own eyes close. The mall, the fountain, the boy, the casserole, all of it can simply rest there, undisturbed, exactly where we left it, while you let yourself rest too. The house around her ticks gently now and then as it cools, the way old houses do, settling into the kind of late summer night that asks absolutely nothing of anyone inside it. Somewhere down the hall, her brother's room is quiet. Somewhere past the closed door at the end of the hall, her parents have long since fallen asleep themselves, the day fully behind them, tomorrow not yet asking for anything either. Nothing in this house is waiting to happen. Everything that needed doing today has already been done. The dishes washed, the notes written, the casserole eaten, the long bright afternoon folded carefully away into nothing more demanding than a fading photograph and a ring that has finally settled all the way back into its own resting colour. Wherever you are tonight, whatever ordinary day you just came from, I hope some small unremarkable part of it turns out, decades from now, to be one you find yourself missing without quite knowing why. That is usually how the best ones work. They do not announce themselves. They simply happen, quietly, while you are busy thinking about something else entirely, and they wait there, patiently, for the version of you far enough down the road to finally notice what they were. Sleep well tonight. Let the fountain keep falling somewhere far behind you, water rising and dropping in that same patient, programmed rhythm it always has, asking nothing of you now except to rest. I will be here again with another quiet evening like this one, whenever you are ready to come back.